Hi there, welcome to my channel. Today, we are going to talk about the theory of liberalism or idealism in international relations. In this video, we will discuss the following points regarding liberalism, starting from the introduction, proponents, main points of liberalism, evolution and the limitations of the theory of liberalism. Liberalism is considered to be the main theoretical challenge to the theory of realism and still has a good place in the modern world politics. It focuses on the points which are ignored by the realism, such as domestic politics, economic interdependence and the global norms and institutions. This theory explains how the domestic politics affects decisions of leaders. It also shed light on the impacts of economic interdependence on the relations among states. Likewise, it explains how global norms and institutions help in cooperation among states. Following are the proponents of the theory of idealism: French philosopher, Montesquieu, German philosopher Immanuel Kant, J.J. Rousseau and the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Following are the main points of the theory of liberalism: unity of humankind, importance of individual, use of power of ideas through education, and reforming conditions of people. Unity of humankind. The liberalists emphasize on the unity of humankind rather than national loyalties to the sovereign states. For example, Montesquieu argued that human nature is not defective. Problems arise when humanity enters civil society and forms separate nations. Similarly, Immanuel Kant says that international anarchy can be overcome through a particular type of collective action, a federation of republics in which sovereignties would be left intact. Importance of individual. The liberalists argue that there is a need to place human rights and freedom ahead of national interests and state autonomy. The 19th century liberalism preferred democracy over aristocracy and free trade over economic self-sufficiency. They saw humanity as capable of satisfying its needs and wants in a rational way. They argued that needs and wants could be met most efficiently when each individual pursued his own freedom and autonomy in a democratic state. Use of power of ideas. The liberalists emphasize to use the power of ideas through education to change world opinion against wars. The liberalists argue that humans are not bad by nature. For example, Montesquieu optimistically stated, "Different nations ought in time of peace to do one another all the good they can, and in time of war as little harm as possible, without prejudicing their real interests." Reforming conditions of people. The liberalists argue that conflicts in world are due to the conditions of people, therefore, they emphasize on reforming the conditions of people to avoid wars. Apart from the points already discussed, liberalists have other important points, which include political reforms for stable democracies and advocacy for global institutions. Political reforms for stable democracies. Liberalists emphasize on undertaking political reforms to establish stable democracies, based on tolerance, compromise, and civil liberties. Democratic political cultures are set as a means of settling disagreements. Woodrow Wilson, for example, proclaimed that democratic government will make wars less likely. Similarly, the liberalists argue that diplomacy is a means to resolve disputes peacefully. Advocacy of global institutions. Liberals recommend replacing balance of power politics with organizations based on the principle that a threat to peace anywhere is a common threat to everyone. One of the greatest advocates of world organizations was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who authored the Covenant of the League of Nations. The basic proposition of Wilson's idealism is that war is preventable through the collective action of states. More than half of the League Covenant's 26 provisions focused on preventing war. The Covenant even included a provision legitimizing the notion of collective security, whereby aggression by one state would be. Evolution of liberalism. Like realism, liberalism also has a long history. Evolution of liberalism. Like realism, Liberalism also has a long history. The contribution of the Enlightenment to liberalism rests on the Greek idea that individuals are rational human beings, able to understand the universally applicable laws governing both nature and human society. Understanding such laws means that people have the capacity to improve their condition by creating a just society. Thus, liberals believe that injustice, war, and aggression are not inevitable but can be moderated or even eliminated through institutional reform or collective action. Contributions of Montesquieu. Montesquieu argued that human nature is not defective, but rather, problems arise as humanity enters civil society and forms separate nations. War is a product of society, not an attribute inherent in individuals. To overcome defects in society, education is imperative. It prepares one for civil life. Groups of states are united according to the law of nations, which regulates conduct even during war. Montesquieu optimistically stated that different nations ought in time of peace to do one another all the good they can, and in time of war as little harm as possible, without prejudicing their real interests. Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, international anarchy can be overcome through a particular kind of collective action, a federation of republics in which sovereignties would be left intact. Kant assumed that states would act in self-interested ways and that the repeated interaction of self-interested states would eventually lead to an expanding zone of peace, in spite of that self-interest. 19th century liberalism. 19th century liberalism preferred democracy over aristocracy and for free trade over national economic self-sufficiency. 19th century liberalism saw humanity as capable of satisfying its natural needs and wants in rational ways. These needs and wants could be met most efficiently when each individual pursued his or her own freedom and autonomy in a democratic state, unfettered by excessive governmental restrictions. Liberalism in 20th century. In the 20th century, people like Woodrow Wilson contributed greatly towards the theory of liberalism. The League of Nations was the idea of Woodrow Wilson. The basic proposition of Wilson's idealism is that war is preventable through the collective action of states. More than half of the League Covenant's 26 provisions focused on preventing war. Following are the limitations of the theory of liberalism. Limited influence of global institutions. Dealing of global institutions with issues other than security and turning foreign policy into global crusade. Limited influence of global institutions on state behavior. The critics of liberalism argue that the global institutions have limited influence on the behavior of states. The powerful states in today's world behave and act in their self-interests. The states are still engaged in power politics and global institutions have a little say to change this behavior of states. Global institutions and security concerns. The critics argue that most studies supportive of international institutions appear in the arena of commercial, financial, and environmental affairs, not in the arena of national defense. Turning foreign policy into moral crusade. A final complaint lodged against liberalism is an alleged tendency to turn foreign policy into a moral crusade, whereas realists claim that heads of state are driven by strategic necessities. Many liberals believe moral imperatives can guide and constrain leaders. Consider the 1999 war in Kosovo, which pitted the North Atlantic Treaty Organization against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Pointing to Yugoslav leader Slobodan Milosevic's repression of ethnic Albanians living in the province of Kosovo, NATO Secretary-General Javier Solana, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and U.S. President Bill Clinton all argued that humanitarian intervention was a moral necessity. Although non-intervention into the internal affairs of other states has long been a cardinal principle of international law, they saw military action against Yugoslavia as a duty because human rights are an international entitlement and governments that violate them forfeit the protection of international law.